Hello, and welcome to another Azure Stack recording. This is covering Platform as a Service and Microsoft Azure Stack. This session is more of an overview of Azure Stack PaaS concepts and capabilities. We have other session recordings that will dive deeper into specific resource providers such as SQL, MySQL, and web apps. So look for those if you are looking for deep implementation, overview, and details. What we'll look at here is the ecosystem of services, what things are delivered as PaaS, and of course we'll even define what PaaS is to make that clear if it's new to you, versus those things delivered as a template. So we'll give the PaaS overview, comparing and contrasting against IaaS and SaaS, and PaaS in public Azure and Azure Stack. Again, what is similar and how they're different. And in those individual sessions on the Azure Stack resource providers for app services, SQL and MySQL, we get even more in depth into the fine details, particularly with SQL Server, because it has more of a subset than the fully delivered SQL Server in Azure. App service, what we get with that, and again, in its current state, we have a subset of capabilities, but we designed this based on customer feedback and what most of the needs are in Azure Stack. And we'll not only look at Service Fabric, but also some other use cases and templates that are available for other services that may not be a fully blown resource provider, but you can still get some complete, fully built or fully designed templates and solutions to do other things that you might otherwise only find as resource providers in the Azure environment. One of the things we always talk about is a unified application development and DevOps cycle. In one of our sessions, we talked about using the ASDK, the Azure Stack Development Kit. This is a great way to practice this before you get into the production environment. You can build and deploy applications the same way, whether they run on-premises with traditional on-premises or hybrid cloud via Azure Stack or in the public cloud. A lot of the same tools that we would use on premises in the public cloud or in Azure Stack, like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, those can all be leveraged in deploying this. So common DevOps lifecycle across Azure and Azure Stack, we want to leverage that as well. And the example I talked about in the ASDK is a customer situation where we were ahead of the curve from the application development side, and it was all because they had the Azure Stack Development Kit, and we were waiting for the deployment of and the coordination with the OEM to do the hardware checks, deploying of the Azure Stack. So this was all flushed out in the ASDK, which is very quick to get set up. And then when we got to the deployment of the actual fully integrated system, the application was already done. It was complete CI/CD pipeline, and then we were able to very quickly and rapidly deploy that into the Azure Stack integrated system, which not only takes the time for the hardware checks, the Azure Stack installation, but also the Azure Stack operator responsibilities of downloading templates and the VM images and the resource providers, which can take a few days to get that going. So by using the SDK, we can practice this, expedite the process, and have a nice dev test environment for your developers to try these things out. In the Azure Stack overviews that we had initially, we talk again about the truly consistent hybrid cloud platform. And so on the left-hand side of the picture here, we have Azure, and the right-hand side, we have Azure Stack. So coming in from the outside in, At the top of the boxes, this is how we get in to a degree. And of course, Azure Stack, you can only get in so far because some of it's a sealed black box, as it is in Azure too. We don't open up the secret sauce or the keys to the vault, so to say, for all the underlying software-defined compute, software-defined storage, and all that sort of stuff. But those are all surfaced through the Azure Resource Manager, and you access these things from the top of the box, each box, through the Azure portal or Azure Stack portal, through PowerShell, and various DevOps tools. They talk to the ARM or Azure Resource Manager API level, and then those communicate with the services inside in the internals of either Azure or Azure Stack. On the third box from the top, you see really the core difference. So we'll talk a little bit more about what IaaS is and PaaS is if you're not crystal clear on that. But in Azure Stack, it's pretty simple to understand what you get when the OEM is done versus what you might need to add later on. So that's what this deck is really more about, not the particulars of how we deploy those and how we patch and update and maintain and back them up, but just the overview of what's possible. And these are the things that if you're new to Azure Stack or you're talking to your business leaders or potential customers, you want them to understand what is possible. And on the right-hand side, third block from the down from the top, you see out of the box from the OEM delivery, we have compute, networking, storage. Those are fundamental services which will exist at deployment time. The other things, for things like app services, functions, service fabric, container service, those would have to be added on by the Azure Stack operator. And of course, you may not want them all, but you determine based on your application requirements, your customer requirements, what is needed. So you need to have those conversations, what kind of VM images they need. So they may need more than one flavor of Linux or more than one flavor of Windows Server. And of course, we deploy these in Azure. We at Microsoft have a cloud infrastructure with our data centers around the world. But in Azure Stack, this is deployed through integrated systems, through our partnership with people like HP, Dell, and Cisco, and others that we have great partnerships with. And that provides consistency in the hardware so that when we do updates, we know what the drivers are and that we can certify those from a security perspective. So only code can run if it's certified for Microsoft or that particular vendor. So we talk about that in the security session. So let's walk through and compare and contrast the three of these things just to make it really clear for everybody as a entry point. IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, versus PaaS, platform as a service, versus software as a service. There's a lot of discussions in the industry about these different terms. So when we first announced Microsoft Azure, our focus has been delivering a PaaS service or offering which you can build applications. An offering in which the platform abstracts you from the complexities of building and running applications. At Microsoft, we fundamentally believe that the future path forward for development is by providing a platform. In fact, you'll see in the upcoming slides, we believe there are a number of new capabilities that should be delivered as services to the platform. The industry has defined these three categories of services, which is the most commonly used taxonomy for differentiating between the types of cloud services. So a little bit clearer definition that will hopefully help out. For IaaS, or infrastructure as services, this is a set of infrastructure level capabilities such as an OS or operating system and network connectivity that are delivered as pay-for-use services and can be used to host applications. In the platform as a service, We have higher level sets of functionality that are delivered as consumable services for developers who are building the applications. They don't have to worry about and say, may I have a server, please? Or that server needs to be updated. It's handled in the back end for them. Software as a service is using a service delivery model. Applications are delivered for organizations to consume and use. And typically, an organization would pay for the use of the application. Alternately, the application could be monetized through ad revenues. We don't have SaaS in Azure Stack, but a typical example a lot of people are familiar with is Office 365. You subscribe, you use the email, everything is completely ready to go. So another way to look at the cloud services taxonomy and how this taxonomy maps to the components in an IT infrastructure is as followed when you consider packaged software. So with packaged software, a customer would be responsible for managing the entire stack, ranging from the network connectivity to the applications. So with IaaS in the middle, the lower levels of the stack in the dark blue are managed by a vendor. Some of these components can be provided by traditional hosters. In fact, most of them have moved to a virtual offering, whether it's in Hyper-V or VMware. Very few actually provide an OS. The customer, though, is still responsible for managing the OS through the applications. An obvious benefit of IaaS is that it frees the developer from many concerns when provisioning physical or virtual machines. And this was one of the earliest and primary use cases for the Amazon Web Services Elastic Cloud Compute, or EC2, when that came out. Developers were able to readily provision VMs, virtual machines on EC2, develop and test solutions, and often run the result in production. The only requirement when that first came out was a credit card to pay for those services. With PaaS, or Platform as a Service, everything from the network connectivity through the runtime is provided and managed by the platform vendor. Microsoft Azure fits best in this category today, in fact, because we do not provide access to the underlying virtualization or OS today. We're often referred to as not providing IaaS. PaaS offerings further reduce the developer burden by additionally supporting the platform runtime and related application services. With PaaS, the developer can immediately begin creating the business logic for an application. Potentially, the increase in productivity is considerable. In addition, since the hardware and operational aspects of the cloud platform are also managed by the cloud platform provider, applications can be quickly taken from an idea to reality. So let's get your time to market much faster than without this capability. Finally, with SaaS, a vendor provides the application, abstracts you from all the underlying components. Again, that's what we have in public Azure and things like Office 365. Azure Stack architecture. So we've had various diagrams of this in some of our presentations, but again, it goes back to the Azure versus Azure Stack. At the top layer in the end user experiences, we have our various ways that we access. We go through the Azure Resource Manager. We have core services. So we talked about fundamentally out of the box before the Azure Stack operator does anything. You've got compute, storage, networking, and key manager. But you also have core services like that ARM provides, the Azure Resource Manager, of subscriptions, resource groups, role-based access control, metrics, and usage. All that stuff is also baked into there, which is part of the extensible service framework. And then we can add additional services, which we'll talk about those at a high level here, more in depth in other sessions. And then there's the underlying cloud infrastructure. In Azure Stack, we use a hyper-converged infrastructure for the software-defined compute storage and networking. And then as we grow and develop this, we will add additional capabilities as we grow and expand this platform for you. And additionally, we have third parties that are working on this, and we'll talk about some of those examples as well. The platform as a service resource provider, again, out of the box by default, you've got none. But if we want to, we can add things like app services. Each of these installs are fairly large, but in a large stack, it's not that large compared to an ASDK. So we talked about in the ASDK, you really need to make sure if you're going to test this that you've got more than the minimum and recommended space of disks. But it's about 60 gig for each install. And again, we'd only do this once for app service. We're not going to install app service 5 different flavors. It's one flavor, but we may add additional hosting servers, and those definitely aren't 60 gig. So we use a minimum of Windows 2016 image for these. There are separate installation procedures for this. One key thing to note, and again, we'll drill down more in depth in the session specifically on app services, but there is a document called Before You Begin, and we recommend that you go through that very thoroughly. There's a lot of things you have to do before you even get to this nice graphical box to set it up, and we'll describe that in that session. And then once this resource provider is installed, you have to add it to offers and plans. Again, we had a session walking through offers, plans, and quotas. So if I successfully complete the installation of Azure App Service, customers can't use it yet because either A, they haven't subscribed to an offer, or if they have subscribed to an offer, I have to add this as an add-on plan or give them a new offer that they can subscribe to, which would also include this. And we could have this as its own offer. So maybe they don't want to pay for IaaS, but they only want PaaS, and that's all they're interested in. So we can make just an IaaS or a PaaS offer that would only contain Azure App Service and not regular VMs. Or we could have a complete Azure IaaS and App Service and whatever else you want, Key Vault, in kind of a combination offer. We talk about that in the offers, plans, and quotas. So we mentioned a lot of prerequisites. And again, if you search Azure Stack App Service Before You Begin, that's how I find it pretty quickly on the web. SQL and MySQL resource providers, again, a whole session. We covered all in this. But again, look at the requirements, the build version, you download the binaries. And a quick note about that is they can be on the stack or off the stack. So the SQL servers or the MySQL servers, if you do app services, in particular, there's a template that will deploy all the requirements for app services, which are SQL servers and file servers in HA configuration. Deploy those on stack. But just like with SQL and MySQL app services, those components could be off stack as well, but you're not going to have the nice, cool, automated template to deploy it. We really recommend you use a template. Microsoft Engineering developed it. It puts in all the bits and pieces very, very nicely. But if you just have to have these things off the stack, the main point is you have to have a clear path of networking to be able to access these things. Also, very important note, so let's look at just SQL as a resource provider by itself versus the SQL as a prerequisite for app services. You cannot use the same SQL box. For the resource providers, the reason why they take control of those servers. So if I'm going to do both app services and SQL resource provider, those are two separate, independent, dedicated servers for those separate resource providers. Very important. In this slide, we take the diagram we had before and kind of adjusted it a little bit. So we still have IaaS, we still have PaaS, and on the right-hand side, we have SaaS. But one of the things that's different that we want to make clear for you is the difference between PaaS using a resource provider, so this is in the dotted box here, versus PaaS using IaaS templated app. So it's a matter of what you manage versus what is managed by the vendor. So in a full-blown resource provider, just like services that are in Azure, if we have app services as a resource provider, all the things in the left side of the dotted box in the dark blue squares are managed by the vendor. In other words, you and your Azure Stack operator. So they would deploy the app services resource provider. They would update the OS. They'd patch all that. But the user doesn't have to do all that work, right? So the user just deals with the applications and the data. Again, less to deal with versus outside of that dotted box on the left-hand side where you see there's more white boxes, which means when they say you manage, that's the customer is the you in that case managing those. So again, it's more pain, more work for them, less time to get to the applications and data, which is where they want to be. In the PaaS templated app in the right side of the dotted box, you see we have things highlighted in yellow or orange. And again, these templates are provided by you being the Azure Stack operator to put that in the marketplace and make that available for the users in the user/tenant space to access these. But the template app deploys this pretty much as IaaS virtual machines and then puts the components in there, which are being deployed wholly into the user/tenant subscription, as opposed to on the left side of the dotted box, when we have a resource provider, all that stuff in the dark blue for the OS, the host servers, the file server, the SQL servers, those are all installed in the Azure Stack operator side of the house. And then they pass through and provide those services for the users to applications, access their applications and data. So to summarize this point and to highlight the comparison and contrasting of these two options, with the resource provider, the underlying resources are abstracted from the user, and maintenance function of those resources can be done by an administrator in the portal using scripting or API calls for the deployment, updates, monitoring, certificate rotation, all that sort of stuff. Resource providers are multi-tenanted. But on the right side of the box, the template-based deployments must be managed like IaaS, because although the Azure Stack operator will provide those template capabilities in the marketplace, or can in some cases, most cases, the user is going to then pull those down in the user space/tenant space, deploy those, and it's really their pets, right? Their pets that they have to manage. It would have distinct management tools and procedures. So taking Kubernetes, for example, it has its own tools and processes to do that. Would be deployed to serve a specific user, maybe in their own resource group for a particular application use case scenario. Doing template-based deployments are less efficient using resources when operating in a multi-tenant environment, because imagine if we had 10 tenants or customers, each of them have to replicate this over and over, and then there may or may not be consistency in how well they deploy them or not, versus if you had an app service that you could provide, you do it once and then many people can access these. Coming in the future, we don't have this quite yet, but there will be enhancements that we're working on in the Azure Stack marketplace. So when you watch the app service or the SQL/MySQL session, when we talk about deploying, the database resource providers have one method, which are scripted installs through PowerShell, and the app services has a variety of scripts and downloadable things and configuration and templates and then a GUI interface. So there's not parity in the way those are deployed. But what we're doing is we're trying to re-engineer this and make it smoother and easier for everyone. And all these will be deployed through the marketplace. So we're looking forward to that, hopefully to improve the user experience. Let's talk about and discuss some other add-on services and a little bit more details about these. You can install Kubernetes using Azure Resource Manager templates generated by the AKS engine on Azure Stack. And if you're not familiar with Kubernetes, it's an open source system for automatic deployment, scaling, and managing of applications and containers. And a container is in an image. The container image is similar to a virtual machine. However, unlike a virtual machine or VM, the container just includes the resources it needs to run an application, such as the code, runtime to execute the code, specific libraries, and settings. Use the Service Fabric cluster item from the Azure Marketplace to deploy a secured Service Fabric cluster in Azure Stack. The Service Fabric cluster in Azure Stack doesn't use the resource provider, Microsoft.Service Fabric. Instead, in Azure Stack, the Service Fabric cluster is a virtual machine scale set with pre-installed software using DSC or desired state configuration. Next, we have the Etherium solution template, which is designed to make it easier and quicker to deploy and configure a multi-member consortium Ethereum blockchain network with minimal Azure and Ethereum knowledge. With a handful of user inputs and a single-click deployment through the Azure Stack tenant portal, each member can provision their network footprint. And this network footprint consists of three things. First of all, a set of load balanced transaction nodes with which an app or user can interact to submit transactions. Second, a set of mining nodes to record transactions. And third, a network virtual appliance. There's also a later connection step which will connect the network virtual appliances to create a fully configured multi-member blockchain network. Pretty powerful. And then we have Azure Cognitive Services. So you can use Azure Cognitive Services with container support on Azure Stack. Container support in Azure Cognitive Services allows you to use the same rich APIs that are available in Azure. Your use of containers enables flexibility in where to deploy and host the services delivered in Docker containers. Container support is currently available in preview for a subset of Azure Cognitive Services, including parts of computer vision, face and text analytics, and language understanding, also known as LUIS, L-U-I-S. So these are some additional add-on services that users can deploy in the user or tenant space. Again, we have one Azure ecosystem from the tools to the experiences to the automations and the capabilities, and we can combine these in hybrid experiences as well to provide very rich applications. Additional platform services from Microsoft Azure. So we can develop Azure services, operate at hyperscale, and add provider experiences, scale, and integration points. One website I do want to show you real quickly here, speaking of all the templates, is if you're at this page, I don't have a shortcut for this because it's actually a link within, but there's the Azure Stack Marketplace items available for Azure Stack. And on the right-hand side here, if I click Microsoft VM images and solution templates, and then at the very bottom, there's also third-party, bring your own license, free trial images, solution templates. So some of these templates are, services like SQL Server, options, SharePoint, et cetera, et cetera. But look at this. We actually have Microsoft Machine Learning Server as a template. And if we go down a little bit further, there's just a ton of solution templates of all sorts of things like a Cassandra cluster, Django, Drupal, lots of neat things here. So explore this page. And again, the title is Azure Marketplace Items available for Azure Stack. So the objective here is to take a look at the range of platform services available in Azure and then map it on Azure Stack. We've covered that already, but this picture is showing, and this is not even current. There's far more choices than we have in this picture. But if you go to that website, you can see the services available in public Azure. We've covered the core resource providers, and that would be the app services that we can install, SQL Server, MySQL. Those are the core ones. And then in addition to that, all the solution templates that we looked at. So let's take a look a little bit deeper at PaaS in Azure Stack, and specifically how it does vary a little bit from public Azure, because that's important to know. So we'll drill down in some of these. First of all, with app services, which provides web apps capability. And a few years back, when we surveyed hundreds of customers, and we said, how do you envision using this? And from their knowledge of the cloud, and also metrics from the cloud, what we see being used most often, web apps was a popular choice and desired application to have. So with app services, you see on the right-hand side, we have web apps and we have API apps. You also get Azure Functions, which we'll talk about in the next slide. We do not have mobile apps, and we do not have logic apps, which create cool little workflows. But again, if you have a hybrid solution that goes across Azure Stack and in Azure, you could leverage the mobile apps or the logic apps in Azure. But by doing web apps, it allows your customers to create personalized customer experiences, scale up and out quickly, centralize websites on one platform. There's continuous deployment options also with things like Git, TFS, GitHub, Visual Studio Team services, and solutions can be built based on Windows and Linux images. App service and API apps. This is something when I started back in Azure 5 or 6 years ago, I didn't see or hear a lot of this going on, but in the last few years, I'm seeing more and more customers use this. So if you aren't familiar with API apps or how or where they've been used, let me give you an example scenario. So in one organization that I worked with recently, they were an organization that created API apps internally. And what this did was, so imagine when you go to buy a car and you go to the dealer, and the dealer then is going to give you a car loan. And to get that car loan, the dealer would then have to communicate with your bank and get information back from your bank. And then based on the approvals and everything that they plug in there for their equations, and that has to be sent back to the dealer and or the car manufacturer if they're responsible for that dealer. So there's this interplay and interaction back and forth between the car dealers and manufacturers and the loan companies and the banks, some of the largest banks in the world. This is all driven through API apps. Another great example, and this was actually even further back in my Azure experience, it was a pharmaceutical company that dealt entirely in API apps. So the scenario is you are a customer and you go to the pharmacy to get some drugs and medication. Well, they're not just going to hand you any kind of drugs, so they have to check and verify from the doctor's office. And the doctor's office has to pull up and look at the records, authorization, approvals, dosage, all that sort of stuff. It has to check all that. And then that information has to be sent back to the pharmacy. Again, this was all done with API apps. So I just want to give a couple real world examples, because this is an area where people aren't as familiar. But we're familiar with APIs and REST APIs, but it's that interchange and interplay between communication between applications where the API apps really shines. And I'm seeing more and more customers do this. So some of the key features of this, you can bring your existing API as is. So there's really no code changes and existing APIs required to take advantage of API apps on Azure Stack. It has integrated support for Swagger API metadata, which makes your APIs easily consumable by a variety of clients. Simple access controls, so we can protect the app from unauthenticated access with no changes to your code. And the service itself provides built-in authentication services, depending on the settings in the service. Visual Studio integration, just like we have with web apps. So all the tools that we like and for dedicated purposes in Visual Studio, they streamline the work of creating, deploying, consuming, debugging, and managing API apps. Another part of app service is functions. And functions are pretty cool. There have been a lot of Microsoft Ignite sessions on this topic out there on YouTube. Also, if you search for serverless functions, it's just running small pieces of code or functions in the cloud. For those of you familiar with Amazon, this would be Amazon Lambda. I learned about this from my son, who had a Lambda function for his mathematics, so he could talk to his voice integrated system and ask how to do his math homework. So it was pretty cool, and it would spit back the answer because it was tied in with that function. So again, the cool thing with functions is there's a lot of choices of language. You can use C#, F#, Node, Python, PHP, Bash, or any executable for that matter. Bring your own dependencies. Supports NuGet, NPM. Integrated security, so it will protect HTTP trigger functions with OAuth providers such as Azure Active Directory and allow the social identity providers like Facebook, Google, Twitter, and Microsoft account. Simplified integration. So with this, and this is what I've seen when you look at the serverless or functions talks from Microsoft Engineering, whether it's on the public Microsoft Ignite or at our internal conventions, they talk about combining functions with other things. So you might connect it with logic apps to create some sort of workflow. You may have it, the functions connect to Event Hub. There's a lot of tie-ins with other Azure services and even software as a service offerings you can do. So pretty cool stuff. You want to check out those sessions on YouTube under Microsoft Ignite. Flexible development, so again, supports continuous integration and deploy your code through GitHub, VSTS, and other supported development tools. And the runtime is actually open source and available on GitHub. So all good stuff. Again, just to recap, mobile apps, logic apps, not available in Azure Stack, nor is it on the immediate roadmap yet. If this is something that's a high priority for you and your organization, again, we have the feedback loops in user voice. So again, just search Azure Stack user voice. That is the voice of you, the customer, to Microsoft. Goes straight to engineering. They review those, and things can change and things can move because we're much more agile, as I mentioned, than we have been in the past, and priorities will shift depending on the needs of the customers. So your voice does matter. Whenever you see a need for something, please have you and your colleagues vote. So I always tell people to search for it on user voice first to see if someone else has it. If it's already there, you vote for it. If it's not, then you can put a suggestion in. SQL Server and MySQL Server. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we have an entire session on this. But this feature is based on the code base from Azure Pack and it's been ported over to Azure Stack. So the resource provider for both SQL Server and MySQL are used to manage the SQL resources in IaaS that you install and configure on the back end. And then it allows users to use that resource provider to connect to a SQL Server instance running in a VM. And again, for SQL in particular, it doesn't have all the richness of Azure SQL PaaS, but it's primarily fundamental CRUD operations for create, delete, update, retrieve, get resource provider metrics. It does support always-on availability groups, and we talk about adding different hosting servers for different options so you can have different SKUs for your customers with this. And everything I said pretty much applies to MySQL Server. The only other thing I want to add here that's a little bit different over on the right-hand side, the considerations. So there's multiple MySQL versions are supported, including community editions, clustered versions, and licensed software. Okay. Another safety tip about both of these, which are a little bit different. We talked about this in some of the other sessions, but just very important to note. When you do app services, those can be installed in the default provider subscription, but for SQL and MySQL, you have to use a BYOL or bring your own license, and those have to be installed. The SQL Server and the MySQL servers themselves, they need to be installed in a tenant subscription, which you can create and you can own as an Azure Stack operator. Okay, but these SQL servers should not be installed in the default provider subscription, but for a SQL server, again, a separate server for app services, you could do that. Service Fabric, so we talked a little bit about this, but just some detailed things. This is pretty interesting stuff where it allows for microservices and kind of an SOA type architecture that really separates functionality into separate smaller services and helps to scale out and by deploying each service independently and creating instances of these services across servers, virtual machines, and containers. Again, as you see in the red ribbon in the upper right-hand corner, this is in the marketplace and it is a templated version. So again, back to how we were describing how this is different from resource provider. You would make it available in the marketplace as an Azure Stack admin. And once it's in the Azure Stack marketplace, any user doesn't require an offer plan quota setting. They just go to, in the tenant/user space, they go to that subscription. They can search for it in marketplace and they'll just see it there. It will be instantly available. Kubernetes service, again, we talked about this in a couple links here. It is a templated version. This is in the marketplace now. And so a couple other things that we didn't mention about it. Helm is actually an open source packaging tool that helps you install and manage the lifecycle of Kubernetes applications. And we can use other tools also, such as Kubernetes as a Service Rancher can also run on Azure Stack. So the actual application running on top of an AKS cluster is agnostic to whether it's running in public Azure or Azure Stack, which means you have high application portability between the clouds. So that's some pretty cool stuff. And Service Fabric is kind of the same sort of way. I actually had a developer who was developing a Service Fabric application on their workstation and was able to easily port that over to the cloud. Blockchain Ethereum service. So I think we've covered most of this and all the details, but we have a link at the bottom if you want to read more about it. So ARM templates, and again, we have an entire session you might want to watch on that if you haven't seen it. ARM templates can be developed that are consistent across Azure and Microsoft Azure Stack. To help with that, delete that. ARM templates can be developed that are consistent across Azure and Microsoft Azure Stack. The key thing to make sure you're aware of, and again, we drill down into more specifics in that particular session, is that it's the API versions that you need to be aware of. So if you go grab a template or make a brand new template from scratch, the best, most surefire way to get it right for Azure Stack is to get the Azure Stack Quick Start templates from GitHub. And those are designed to work with all the versions and flavors and supported images within Azure Stack. If you want to make a template from scratch or you found one in Azure that you like, you're just going to have to go through and tweak and adjust things. Another caveat I tell people when you use the Quick Start templates, they're really fantastic, but they really kind of make a complete whole environment. They're not going to be parameterized for you to fill in blanks in some cases, maybe a little bit, but some things aren't going to be fill in blanks. So for example, if you have some servers that build a solution, that template usually will build a network and the subnet and all those artifacts around it as well. But in your environment, you may have already laid down that plumbing for the networks, which network administrators like to do to define those ranges so there's no conflict with any other networks that it might be connected to. So you always have to massage those Quick Start templates a little bit in most cases. In some cases, they might work just fine. And one example I always talk about is in app services for the prerequisites that installs a beautiful template that does the SQL servers and the file servers. You run that, it is parameterized, so it does everything really, really well. And we've talked about the consistent tools. The one that we didn't mention is Kudu. So that is for web apps. Those folks that are familiar with web apps are familiar with Kudu, and it's the same experience in Azure Stack as they have in Azure as well. So what if a desired Azure service is not available in Azure Stack? Well, you can deploy a hybrid solution combining Azure Stack services with Azure services. And where that's not possible, some services can be run in IaaS on Azure Stack as a substitute. For example, Apache Cassandra data stacks to run a NoSQL database instead of Azure Cosmos DB. So you can possibly build it as long as Azure Stack supports, the required machines or the sizes and things like that. But again, if you're going to do that, one of the best ways to test it is with an ASDK and Azure Stack Development Kit before you deploy it. I think we've covered this pretty well. Developer consistency, connecting to the cloud, connecting to Microsoft Azure Stack. When we do deploying the solutions, the same flow when connecting to either public or Microsoft Azure Stack, you can do that. And then also the source control providers are very similar and the same that we have in Azure Stack as in Azure also. And it's just a screenshot. We actually have more of a demo in one of our other sessions, but this shows where I get a JSON outline on the left-hand side, which is nice. And actually this shows up in the templates option. When you search in the marketplace for templates, there's a simple editor. We'll give you that JSON outline as well, so you can see the parameters, the variables, the resources, any outputs. But in here, I can actually also go in and modify the JSON, and then we can deploy or we can add on additional components as well. And we see other things here. I can adjust the source control, upload the file in File Explorer. We have a lot more control and manageability using Visual Studio. There you go. That's all we have on this session for app services in Azure Stack. I hope this was useful. Make sure you check out the related sessions on. There you go. That concludes this session on Platform as a Service on Microsoft Azure Stack. And our goal here was to give you a high-level overview of Azure Stack PaaS concepts and capabilities. If you or your Azure Stack operators need more in-depth about specific resource providers, such as App Services, SQL, or MySQL, make sure to check out those sessions where we drill down into deployment, configuration, and maintenance of those services as well. Thank you very much, everyone. This is Mark Grimes presenting, and you have a fantastic day. Goodbye.